Matthew, hello.
Hello, Tim.
Hey, we're going. uh, yeah, so thank you very much for making some time today to come on the third party show and talk with me. Um, I I came across you a couple of days ago on Twitter when I saw your post where you were confirming that what people had been suspecting that you were leaving your role at the University of Alabama. Um, I thought that that was an interesting post, the reasons that why you had given for why you were leaving. And so then I did a little bit of research and had a look and went to your website and checked out some of that. And wow, you do some interesting stuff in the field of earth sciences. I wonder if you would tell us maybe a little bit about that first before we perhaps go into some other more relevant topics. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. My training and my background is isotope geochemistry. I did a PhD at UCLA, and I started at the University of Alabama as a faculty member in 2016. And most of my research interests tended to be on early Earth. So we're looking at basically the time period on Earth when there was no rock record, and so this is going to be pre 4 billion years ago. We don't really have a good rock record. But amazingly, we have these little minerals, these little grains of sand, and they're this mineral called zircon. And you can do a lot of dating and trying to figure out what the early Earth looked like. And this is a real important time period for things like origin of life
Mm.
and onset of plate tectonics, possibly when oceans actually either were delivered or outgassed out of the planet. There's a couple competing hypotheses. So that kind of tends to be where my focus really lied for my PhD. And then as I also work in some fields of impact craters. So early Earth had a lot of impact craters coming in because the solar system isn't cleaned up yet. So the planet is still kind of cleaning its orbit. So you have lots of things whizzing in. And um, I do a lot of work in impact cratering processes, trying to figure out how significant these things are. Can I link them to mass extinction events? These would be more modern ones, obviously. I dabble a little bit in things like medical mineralogy. So we were having a project where we were looking at kidney stones. Kidney stones are a rock essentially that forms inside the kidney, so we can use a lot of the same processes that we use in the natural world and rock samples, but apply it to kind of a medical side. And I'm not sure if you know, but there's no real cure for kidney stones. You pretty much have to pass them. They sonicate them if they break them up, and then you have to pass them. And it's not something that's lethal, but it's very painful. It affects something like 12% of the world's population. And so we've been dabbling a little bit in that. And then on social media, I do a lot of reviews of climate literature. And because I'm not a climate scientist per se, and I'm not someone that works for like oil and gas exploration. I kind of felt like I was an independent party. I use a lot of the same techniques, isotope geochemistry, that climate science uses. And so a lot of my online personality is discussing climate and things like that.
Yeah, wow. I imagine with your background though, you are relatively well placed to comment on climate.
Yeah, yeah. The systems. I mean, in terms of like atmospheric physics and things, I don't really dabble with that or modeling. But in terms of like what Earth's past climate was like,
Mm.
it's all isotope geochemistry that essentially gives you those numbers. So it's the same machines I use, it's the same statistics I use. So I felt like I was a pretty good expert, at least to judge that side. And I didn't really have one foot in either field, so I thought I could take an objective look.
Um, the term you mentioned there, climate, that's an interesting one because it seems like a lot of people really confuse weather with climate.
All day. It's happening in New Zealand today with the rain in Auckland. That's evidence of climate change. And I try to correct people all the time that there's a big important distinction between weather and climate, and confusing those can really give you the wrong picture and the wrong idea. And the media loves to do it, right?
Yeah, I think there was today, there was a post from, was it the head of the media group for Greenpeace New Zealand? And they had said, looking at the floods today in Auckland, this is related to too many cows, which I thought was quite a stretch. I mean, there's been floods many, many times here.
And the implication is almost like if you get rid of meat eaters and you get rid of cars, you'll never have another flooding event,
Mm.
which is absurd. And it's funny you brought up Greenpeace because I'll be meeting with Patrick Moore, who was one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, in Orlando, who's long left the group and is much more of a climate skeptic now. But he's one of the co-founders of Greenpeace. We'll be together at a climate conference in Orlando at the end of February.
Ah, that was the one that Jordan Peterson commented on. Give him hell.
Yes. He's given me a lot of exposure. So, I think as I was getting more and more disgruntled, I started kind of reaching out to him, and we've talked through email or through Twitter, email, direct message. And so he's really given me a lot of support. He's given me a lot of exposure. I mean, he's such a big name in this kind of space of looking and investigating things that maybe, we have a false idea of, and trying to just have open discussions about this stuff.
I think on this topic, he's definitely been willing to consider perhaps looking at the other side of what the popular narrative is around the climate. Because I don't think many people would say that there's not increases in temperatures. I think in modern times there's increases in temperatures, but that again, something which has happened in the past will happen again in the future.
Yeah, and in urban areas, I think a good chunk of it is an urban heat island effect. When you see these urban areas growing and they're covering what used to be grass and forest with asphalt and concrete, you have a heating effect. You get these urban heat island effects, and so many people now are living in urban areas, right? We've had this big migration away, basically from rural areas to more urban areas, that they're experiencing warmer temperatures. I absolutely agree. I think they are experiencing warmer temperatures. But whether that is directly a result of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, how much of that is natural variability, and then whether or not this is leading to a ton of extreme events and there's going to be 8 or 5 billion people migrating, and Al Gore talking about the oceans boiling, so making those connections and distinctions is important.
Yeah, there's a lot of, in the mainstream media around this topic, it seems like there's a lot of focusing on the extreme negatives that could occur, and then very little on some of the positives that are out there. And it seems like extra CO2 in the atmosphere not being toxic for people, being great for plants, something that we might see increased crop yields with, reduction of needs for fertilizer. These seem like positive things, but they're never sort of balanced or mentioned.
Absolutely not. And that's one of the problems. And human nature is just kind of, we focus on the negatives. I play a lot of golf, and if I hit a really good drive or a really good golf shot, I kind of forget by the next shot. But if I hit a terrible one, I'm thinking about it for the next 5 or 6 holes. Yeah. So I think it's human nature to kind of focus on the negatives, but it does give you a false sense of what the planet is really like and what the problem is. And it's more difficult to overcome challenges if you don't understand what the nature of the planet is.
Yeah, that's right. If you're focusing on something which perhaps isn't the real problem, or at least the outcome that you're seeking may not be the solution that you want to helping the environment. Because sure, there's problems around overfishing, there's problems with pollution. Again, I don't think anyone's denying these. But
absolutely.
And they may be the type of things we want to really be focusing our energy on, rather than just the negative of what may happen if the temperature rises.
Yeah, that's what I argue. So I show a graphic in my class that 2.1 billion people on the planet don't have access to clean drinking water. That's 1 in 4 people on the planet. If you think those people care that the planet's going to warm in a degree or 2 in the next, by 2100 or 3 degrees, they don't care about that. We need to give people, basic human necessities before they're going to really start thinking about a couple degrees of warming and the impacts of that.
That's right. It's very easy for us in the West, where we're developed, and to say, "Oh, well, turn off your air conditioners," and then we do, in the developing countries, you should do the same. Well, some of these people don't have air conditioners. They're growing and trying to bring themselves up, their living standards up. For us to say, "No, stop using these products, stop doing that," it's a little arrogant.
Absolutely. I think it shows such a privilege.
Yeah.
And so I used to live in Somalia, actually, in Mogadishu. This is 1986. I went to 2nd grade there. And a real clear memory I have is like almost nightly, maybe every other night, the hum of the generator next door that kicked on because we would lose power every night or every other night. and how that affected the infrastructure that these people could live in. And they literally live in abject poverty
Yeah.
because they don't have access to energy. And if we could provide them access to energy, I think we could bring a lot of people up and do a lot of good. And then we can talk about, starting to shift them into cleaner technologies. But to think that we're going to go out and build a bunch of solar farms and wind farms
Yeah.
and support, the 900 million people now in sub-Saharan Africa, that's absurd. And
Yeah.
if the UN and people like John Kerry are out there saying that we warn you not to exploit your own fossil fuel resources is so evil to me. It's not equitable. It goes against everything that we'll probably talk about in terms of DEI in a minute. But it's remarkable that we have this focus on equity now, especially in the Western world. But when it comes to climate, we're doing the exact opposite. We're going to
Mm.
leave these people in poverty for decades longer than they ever should be. And I think that's unfair and not, the way to go about this.
Yeah. Have you working in the university environment? What's it like today in terms of climate alarmism, DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion? How are you feeling that?
Well, I mean, I think that there's been especially after 2020, there's been a huge increase in the DEI kind of terminology and how decisions are being framed. There's a great article that came out last month from the National Academy of Scholars, and they did a real simple search where they went into US institutions and they crawled the web pages and they looked for terms that were DEI terms and STEM terms in the same page. And what they found was there was this kind of steady increase from like 2010 to 2020. And then there was a five-fold increase from 2020 to today.
Mhm.
So there has been this dramatic rise in the way that public institutions are making decisions, and they're framing it through this DEI lens, whether it's students, how they're going to bring in new students, how the students are incorporated into the community, how they're hiring faculty, you know, all of the decisions now are being framed through this lens. And, although it may have had good intentions originally, I think it's having poor outcomes. And then, the students have the image of the climate that you would get from the news
Mm.
because that's where they get their information. So something I push back a lot against is a lot of people want to go out and investigate this stuff and try to figure it out, but most of the scientific research is hidden behind paywalls.
Mm.
And even though it's publicly funded research, which the public has paid for, they have to pay again in order to see the results. So even if somebody was a citizen scientist and they wanted to do the investigations and they're interested in the stuff, they have to pay so much money to have access to this stuff. I sit on the library committee at the university, so we talk to the journals and they rip us off. We try to negotiate down. It's a whole racket, but um, we get the numbers of how many subscriptions to these journals are from institutions and how many are from private citizens. And it's all from institutions. There's very few private citizens that spend the money or the time to actually go in and investigate the research. So the students have the picture that you probably could imagine if they just watched the news.
Yeah, I can completely see how they would get that. There's just uh, such a force in the mainstream media being so prevalent, and being prevalent in social media as well, that it's difficult to see other opinions, and it's becomes, I think, dangerous in terms of careers, and even just prohibitive if you are working somewhere to challenge perhaps the narrative of your employer.
Absolutely. And so many now, corporations have taken a stance. The funding agencies take a stance. So part of getting tenure at a U.S. institution is getting grants. And if you want to land these federal funded grants, part of what you have to write is a broader impact statement about how your research affects diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I don't really understand when I go out in the field and I figure out that an impact crater is 55 million years old instead of 52 million years old, that has some sort of impact on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, what we do is we check the box. We all kind of have the buzzwords that we write, and we just check that box because we don't want to rock the boat. But all of these little incremental things can have really bad consequences when you take them and kind of take a whole view of all this.
Yeah, it's interesting that the word merit rarely comes up in university or hiring procedures. When you're looking at diversity, equity, inclusion statements, that the word merit doesn't apply, which is something which is interesting, because you would think that giving everyone opportunity would mean that you would look at people based upon their merits and select people who were best skilled, fitted for the role.
Yeah, absolutely. Particularly in a university setting, we're so merit focused, right? We have grades and GPAs and standardized tests. And all we do in the university is we try to prove by showing, testing, or scoring how well we understand the information. And what's happening, one of these poor drawbacks that's happening, is that I think the the community, the industry, private sector, they're not holding the they don't think that the minority students that are graduating from U.S. institutions worked as hard. And I'll give you a story from my father. So my father was a business professor for almost 3 decades, and one of his most memorable students was an African American gentleman who went on, got his MBA. He was a business professor. He went on and got his MBA and became an executive in a hospital. Was very successful, one of the main business leaders in the community. And when you become one of these big business leaders, you kind of interact with the business school a lot because you have interns and stuff. So they would see each other and they would talk. And he asked him once what this gentleman felt about what we were calling at the time affirmative action. This is a little while ago. He's been retired for a while now. And he was shocked by the response, because the response he got was that this gentleman hated it. And in fact, he felt that even now, after he's become an executive, he's won awards. When he goes into a room with his business peers and the community leaders, he feels that they still look at him and don't think that he had to work as hard to get to where they did. Even though he was one of the top students, he was acing everything. He didn't get any of the affirmative action because he was already one of these top guys. And so, he could never get out from under that umbrella. And we see that. So the NSF gives us the data of how many minorities are in the STEM fields and how many are getting jobs in the STEM when they graduate. And we've seen a slight increase in the minority students that are in the STEM fields. And there's been an increase in the students a little bit, but them getting jobs in the industry has stagnated, if not even almost decreased. And I think that's a reflection that the business leaders and the community leaders in the private sector doesn't really, think that these folks earned as much as the others. So if you have an equal playing field, you're going to take the non-minority person because you think that they worked harder and they achieved more, and so they're going to be the better employee. And that's a natural decision for any business leader. You want the person that's the most productive. I think this is an unintended consequence, but I think it's a real consequence.
It's sort of showing a disconnect between the business world, what it wants, and what the university perhaps thinks it wants for its students that it's going to push out afterwards after they've completed their studies.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, very, very interesting topic. I think the impacts of this will be far, far reaching, given that they're starting in universities. So there's so many children coming up, going to university, not having a wider outlook on life, getting into courses which perhaps are not going to set them up for getting a rewarding or fulfilling role in the future. That then creates a whole heap of people who are just generally unhappy with what's happened. So culturally, there's an impact, and it's a real impact when you end up with people who suddenly have done 4 years at university, paid a heap of money for a course, get out there, and businesses like, we're not really interested in the course that you've done, or we don't think we don't think you're right for it. Your grades aren't as good as we would have expected. That's a tough situation to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially if you turn on the news and they're telling you the planet's going to end in 8 or 10 or 12 years.
Yeah. How does that make...
Add that to that? Yeah, it's crazy that we think this is a good way to inspire young people and motivate them to become good stewards of the environment. This is the exact opposite of how adults normally behave.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
And it's got to be setting up these kids, again, just to feel pointless. What's the point in the future? If they're being told, hey, your whole planet's going to be wrecked in 12 years' time, well, then what's the point of going on to university and trying something else? Yeah.
Absolutely. I have students. So part of what got me to speak up about this was during COVID, I was talking to a lot of students because we were doing virtual learning, and that was pretty much a disaster. But something that I think the students did was they opened up a little bit because they're sitting in their dorm room in their pajamas and everybody's left the Zoom. And so I could talk to some folks. And sometimes, people would be coming into my office once we went back into class. And I had a multiple female students tell me they didn't plan to have children anymore
Yeah,
because they felt guilty if they brought a child into this world.
that's
And
terrible.
why would they bring a child into the world if they only make it to age 10? Because,
Yeah,
there's a clock somewhere. Literally, there's a clock on the side of a building somewhere counting down to, nothing, because nothing's going to happen when it hits zero. They're just going to reset that clock and keep doing it like they always do, right? They kick the can down the road. But, if we really want to inspire young people to innovate and solve problems and be creative and sacrifice now so that they can do, live a better life in the future, this is the exact opposite way to go about it.
yeah, yeah. The you mentioned earlier the invitation to the conference on climate. What's that about?
So this is the Heartland Institute. So it's a conservative think tank, basically. This is groups of folks that discuss possibly other factors that are overlooked in the climate community. Talks about a lot about policy and whether or not climate policy is actually doing more damage than a couple degrees of warming. Um, in terms of things like, for example, developing countries and what are the consequences of trying to electrify everything. So this is just it's a conservative group of climate skeptics really that come together and chat. But there's a lot of politicians that come. There's a lot of industry leaders that come, and so we hope to just kind of show them a side of an argument that they don't really see if all they're doing is clicking on the news and everything that's there. These are all they're faculty members, they're retired atmospheric physicists and things, and a lot of the research that they're showing is all in the peer-reviewed literature, but for some reason it never gets the rounds, makes the rounds in the normal media. And so
Yeah.
just want to, I think the goal is to expose some, these leaders to some of this, but this will be my first time attending. So, I'm going to kind of experience it for the first time.
That'd be interesting. The point you make there is really true too. You see just recently with Elon having purchased Twitter. And all of the discussion that's come up about people who are being banned, purely because of their more conservative point of views. As perhaps this may start to change and things become more balanced, we might see more of this other research coming up and becoming available for people to read. But I do think it's an interesting state we're in where you can't even safely just challenge the narrative without people starting to call you names. Climate denier. Are you a climate denier? It's like, well, no, not really. I'm just trying to read the data and make a decision. Yeah.
Yeah, it's remarkable, right? It's remarkable that, you can have like 15 different genders and there's a whole spectrum of gender. But when it comes to climate, it's binary.
Yeah.
It's like if you ask questions, you're automatically thrown into the denier group.
Yeah.
And otherwise you just have to take the whole pill and just swallow it with everything else. There's no middle ground, and it's just crazy in this time of fluidity where we're always talking about things aren't binary. Somehow climate became a binary choice. It's remarkable.
Climate's the binary issue.
Yeah, right. And it's like, and how complex it is. There's so much nuance, and there's a whole spectrum, and you always hear this. The 97% of scientists agree. I'm like, you're right. 97% of scientists agree that humans can have an impact on the environment.
Yeah, of course.
You know where they fall? There's some of them are talking about 1%. Some of them talk about 99%.
Yeah.
There's a whole spectrum in the middle.
And so we are going to have an impact. We're humans. We're all over the planet. We're the most capable beings in terms of tooling and what we can do and how we can influence our environment, for sure. But that doesn't mean that we can't adapt and respond and benefit from some of these things. It would be interesting. It actually was interesting. I went to ChatGPT and asked it. I said, tell me about the benefits of global warming. And you can see how either the data set it's been bred upon or some moderation is happening, because it did come up with a couple of ideas. It said, well, yes, we could have increased growth and crop yields, but overall, this doesn't outweigh all the negative effects. And I thought it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And not only will it is affecting crop yields. If I love to go to Our World in Data, that website
Mhm.
where you can get all these amazing graphics. And something that I show in my class all the time is that, if you look at the yield in almost every major thing, it's wheat, grain, cereal, everything, you kind of separate these things into groups. Almost all of them show this dramatic continued increase. And what's really a positive turn is that what you're seeing now is that that increase continues, but the land use has dropped.
Yeah,
So we're using less land to produce more
more.
food, and so we see these effects already. Yeah, I've just been playing around with ChatGPT a little bit just now, and so I'm fascinated with how AI is going to affect the entire planet. Um, but yeah, it's clearly it's being fed the information from the one side of the information.
Yeah, it is. It is. It is an amazing tool. I've spent many years as a software developer, and I work with some guys like that. And so I played with it a couple of weeks ago. Where one of the guys in my team said, "Oh, hey, I'm just waiting to get a call from the doc. Just I'm gonna have a chat. I'm not feeling very well." I said, "Oh, don't worry about it. I'll get you the diagnosis." So I jumped onto ChatGPT and said, "Can you give me a diagnosis for my friend Joe, who's got a bit of a cough and a recurring itch?" And it comes back with this great, diagnosis and a suggestion for what drugs you should take to deal with it. And so when the other guys, the developer in my team, said, "Well, at least it can't code." And so I thought, So I went to
Yes,
ChatGPT
it
and
can.
yeah, I said, write me a JavaScript line that'll do this. And it came back with it. I sent it back to him. And then I thought, oh, wow, hang on. And I got the code and I broke it intentionally and then pasted the broken code back in and said, fix this. And it fixed it. Yeah, it's amazing.
That's got to be kind of scary too on the software engineering side, and like so. I mean, so many people are going to be replaced
Well,
by this. It's
that's
remarkable.
that's level one with me just playing with it. If you were to sit down now and say, okay, let's develop some software to use ChatGPT. It's not just a person to interact with it transactionally one by one by one to get some code, but actually build something to ask it to repetitively build code. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people whose jobs will be under threat from this.
I heard that there's a couple Twitter group or Twitter people that use ChatGPT to make tweets
Yeah.
that have actually shown that it actually goes viral. They've huge increases in following. That they're using the AI system to kind of keep tweeting about the newest stuff that's in the
Yeah.
news, and they don't have to do anything. And this thing is sending these things out, and they just see their followers grow like crazy. It's just
Makes
remarkable.
makes complete sense. Yeah, it
Yeah.
does.
Yeah,
Um,
it's makes me a little nervous still because that's a dramatic change in how we operate on the planet. But hopefully, it's going to be used for good.
yeah, well, I mean, some of it will be used for good. I guess that's a risk is if someone does actually weaponize it in some way, because it's going to be it'll be tough to deal with depending on how it's weaponized. Um,
Yeah,
just as a tool now for people to maybe become a little more productive at work, it's fine. But if it is used to maybe say influence the stock market in some negative way or something like that, it's a challenge. Hey, what's your impression or opinion on nuclear as a fuel source, energy
yeah.
source?
So I'm a huge proponent of nuclear. I mean, I think that if you look at how humans have evolved in terms of energy, what we see is that we started with low density materials. So we burn wood. I do a lot of work in Tibet. For my postdoc, we were doing a evolution of the Himalaya. So we spent about a couple, 4 or 5 weeks, a couple times in the field out in Tibet. And when they cook in Tibet, they use dung.
Mm,
It's dried yak dung. And one thing I noticed is you could see all of the dark like snot in these kids because they're in
yes.
these homes where
Yeah.
this yak dung is being cooked. It's so smoky. But if you see this progression from low density to higher density things, coal, natural gas, I see that progression continuing. That seems like a
Mm.
natural, wise progression to me. Nuclear is by far the most power density rich fuel we have. I think the French do it really well. This is again one of these irrational fears that humans have because we don't really understand radiation. even though I've been reading a lot of papers and I'm going to have a discussion with someone about low dose radiation actually being very healthy, that there is some research that shows that a low dosage can actually have really positive effects. But people just think of Chernobyl and stuff like that, and they
Mm.
freak out. Even though if you go into the data, the amount of people that really lost their life overall, even with all the cancers and everything, is relatively low. If the claim that something like 5 million people are dying every year from inhaling the combustibles from fossil fuels,
Yeah.
then all of those things get very small. And so this is again one of these irrational fears that humans have that, somehow I think we have to overcome, because if we really want clean, carbon free power, we need nuclear. That's
Yeah.
going to be the base load. We need a reliable source. You have to have the base load. Wind and solar will have their applications. They'll be important parts of the whole solution, but without a reliable base load, it's not going to happen. And I think the French are really good at reprocessing fuel, dealing with their nuclear waste. Nothing is going to be free. You're never going to not have a consequence to deal with, right? So any energy source, you'll have to have issues, and you have to mitigate those issues. And some one of those is nuclear waste. But I think we have a lot of good solutions. The planet is really good at storing nuclear waste if we can bury it deep enough. We know that there's these rocks that have very high radiation levels, but you go to the surface, you don't see them at all, right?
Yeah.
You put these things in a stable area where tectonics isn't going to affect it for millions of years, and so we have ideas of how to deal with this stuff. But if CO2 is an existential threat to the planet, then we should be developing nuclear like crazy. And we're
Yeah.
doing the exact opposite. California's closing their plants.
Yeah, it was interesting that Germany, once they got into the stoush with Russia and realised they're going to lose access to their gas, suddenly moved nuclear energy back onto the approved list of energy sources. But they've put themselves in a hole. They've shut down nuclear reactors. Now they're going to try and start them up again. There is some interesting research, which I've had a bit of a look at. Helion fusion generators, they have a really neat way of generating power. So they're a fusion approach, but they remove all of the components of loss in a normal reactor. A normal reactor, you heat water to high pressures, and then you turn that into steam, and then you turn a turbine, and that turbine will eventually generate electricity. With the Helion reactors, the actual reaction itself, the charged particles, as they fuse and move, they push back against the magnetic field which is containing them. And so that magnetic field then immediately induces an electric current. You've got rid of all the water, all the mechanics. So it's a really...
Wow, I didn't realize that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go look those up. That's fascinating.
Yes, it looks super futuristic. The way they use what they call peristaltic acceleration with magnets to fire two toroids, two donuts of plasma at each other, and then when they hit in the middle, they inject a little bit of deuterium and something else as the fuel source, and that's what causes the reaction.
Wow.
It's cool. Yeah.
And is it scalable?
They're at, I believe it's like iteration 6 of their reactor. And I think that they feel that by iteration 8, they'll be in a position where it starts to perhaps become scalable, or at least, more energy positive. Yeah. I haven't got into the real detail of it, but it looks, if not promising, at least very interesting.
Yeah, I think that sounds awesome. If it maintains a high power density, then I'm all on board.
Yeah.
I think that for sure we know that the solution will never be wind and solar alone.
Yeah.
It just can't be. The ecological damage, the footprint alone would be huge. And I talk a lot about, species loss and habitat destruction, which I argue are much bigger issues to species than a couple degrees of warming. A fox wakes up in the morning and it experiences 2 or 3 degrees in the first 15 minutes of the sunrise of warming. It's doing fine. But if you take away its habitat, it's going to have a very big problem. Yeah. So I argue that the ecological footprint is so small also of these high power density fuels like nuclear, or like what you were just talking about, that that's going to have to be the solution if we want to really talk about reducing habitat destruction
Yeah.
and not being surrounded by wind farms and solar farms.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. The work that you've been doing around impacts with the Earth, can you tell me about that? Because that sounds really interesting.
Yeah, so my whole PhD was on trying to better date what when or certain impacts occurred. So usually what happens is a big impactor will come in, it slams into the planet, and it brings in so much energy that it melts the rocks and it makes this nice little melt pool in the crater. And then as that melt pool rises and solidifies, it makes a little mineral zircon that I use to date the crater. So I'm not really dating the impact itself. I'm kind of dating when that melt crystallized, but it's pretty close. That's going to be within 100,000 years or so of when the impactor hit. And then the goal of that is to, if we can get really accurate dates, then we can go and look into things like the fossil record and things like that to see what were the environmental and global effects of these different size impactors coming in. And so I was always fascinated at, thinking about big, big picture, deep, like extinction events. There's not really many. A super volcano can do a lot of damage and it will change the climate, but we'll probably live through that. A giant impact could be one of these weird extinction event type of deals. And so I always
Yeah.
found it very fascinating to me. And something else we're doing is we think that how these impacts are coming in early on the planet has a real effect on what the surface looks like because you're constantly being bombarded. And that's going to have an effect on what types of elements are available at the surface and whether water's available. And we try to tie that into when was the possibility of the origin of life? When do we think there was an environment suitable? When do we have the right elements? Because you need the rocks at the surface to provide the right ingredients so that you can start to get these precursor biological molecules to form. And eventually, we don't really understand that one step where these things become self-replicating. But we think that if we can understand when the planet has all that material available, then that's probably a good time of when life probably kicked off.
Do we have ideas on what the missing step is? Like, are there thoughts and theories on what's happening there?
Yeah, there's a lot. So this is where things like hydrothermal vents come in, where you can have these um, these reactions being driven by heat. Because one thing we don't know on early Earth is whether or not we had a magnetic field yet, because the inner core hadn't actually solidified. It was all still a liquid core, and we think that it's the liquid outer core spinning around the solid inner core that makes the geodynamo, which creates the magnetic field. So if you don't have a magnetic field, maybe if you're below the ocean, you're protected from all
Mm.
those nasty particles that are coming in from the sun, because the sun's great and it's producing all of the energy we're basically getting, but it's also throwing a lot of nasty stuff at us, right? The solar wind. And so there's theories about hydrothermal vents. There's a lot of theories about like tidal pools, because certain reactions seem to be favored when there's a wet conditions. Others seem to be favored when there's dry conditions. So having
Yeah,
these tidal areas where you can have
can have
drying and
both.
wetting, exactly. But the that one step where it kicks off, and we could really call it life, where it's self-replicating, and that's that's the holy grail.
Yeah. And so, what are the precursor parts that we do know about? Like, how close are we to
So it's pretty remarkable. So if there's a meteorite called the Murchison meteorite, it actually fell not too far
Australia?
from you in Western Australia.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I was out there in Murchison doing some work on some. They have really old rocks out there, and had a great time. They called me Rock Licker, as that was my geology name. You're one of those rock lickers? I'm like, I guess. All these big mining guys, but we had a good time. We drank a lot of beer and played pool together. But there was this meteorite that landed out there in Murchison, and remarkably, what they found was that it had something like 12 or 14 amino acids in it. So one thing that we've learned is that, and we found these now in a lot of meteorites, that there are processes in space that are creating amino acids, and those amino acids are being delivered by
Mm,
meteorites to the surface of the planet. So we call these precursor biological ingredients because they're not really organic. The way we know they're not organic is all the amino acids in your body have a handedness to them. So these are molecules that are not symmetric, and it's always on one side where this thing is added, and we call it a handedness. And so all organic amino acids in every living thing on our planet was we call right-handed. And when we look at Murchison, what we find is it's a 50-50 mix of right and
Left-handed.
left-handed.
Wow.
Yeah, so we think that this must have been some sort of abiotic process occurring in space that at least wasn't like what's happening today as life on Earth, because we'd expect them all to be either left or right-handed. And so this maybe was an abiotic process, but what it's doing is it means that when life kicked off on the planet, it didn't need to start from scratch.
Yeah.
It had some of these materials, and really amino acids are the building blocks of
Yeah.
everything, proteins, DNA. And so it wasn't starting from scratch. So that's really fascinating. And then, this brings up the idea of things like panspermia,
Yeah.
where life was delivered. If these meteorites exist and there's all these precursor molecules floating around in space, well, they're being delivered to Mars as well. They're being delivered to Venus as well. So, maybe early Earth was so inhospitable, but maybe Mars was just right, 4 billion years ago or so. And then something whizzes in and whacks into Mars. Because Mars is on the outer orbit, that stuff is getting sucked in towards the sun, so it crosses Earth. Some of it falls onto Earth, and you can kind of kick off life like that. But
Yeah.
I find that stuff fascinating. So my original background is biochemistry and cellular biology. That's my degree, my bachelor's. And so I kind of shifted into geochemistry, but I kind of find a way to mix them back by thinking about like the origin of life.
So with that right and left-handedness, does that indicate that possibly in space there is forms of life that are left-handed rather than being right-handed?
Our argument, or not our, but the astrophysicist's argument is that that's a sign of randomness,
Okay.
a sign of that is that's not it's an abiotic process.
Okay.
It's the same way it's the same type of things we get if we just do this in a test tube. We end up with half left and
Okay.
half right.
But
Yeah,
right-handed is what seems to work for life. It seems to be required that
every single thing from a little algae, a bacterial thing, to you and to everything in between.
So, have you seen Graham Hancock's theories on the civilization and the comet impact? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, absolutely. I think he's fascinating. I like to, listen to him talk. I think, there's a lot of interesting things that we see happening about 10 or 12,000 years ago. This younger Dryas is a very interesting time in the recent geologic past that we don't really have good explanations for. Um, I just I want to find more evidence of the impactor. So where did it hit? 12,000 years ago isn't that long ago. Was it an air blast? Even at an air blast that long ago, I feel like there should be more evidence. He talks about strewn fields and things, and but I love to hear about it and think about it. I'm still not totally convinced, but I do find it fascinating, and I love to kind of explore these what would be considered fringish topics, but you know, end up being ignored because science kind of puts itself into a box a lot of times, and we kind of just chug away,
Yeah.
in one direction. And so, I think people like Joe Rogan are great at bringing these ideas up, and it's not, it's not going against the science. It's thinking and
Yeah.
discussing and being creative. And if you think that we can explain everything in history, that's crazy. There are so many unexplained things in history. So we should think outside the box and try to come up with, all of these different ideas. But it seems to be gaining a lot more traction here in the last couple of years. I'm seeing him more and more. It seems to be one of the questions I get most often now
Is it?
is,
Oh,
have you
yeah.
heard about Graham Hancock?
Maybe.
Yeah, and I'm like, I
Well,
find it fascinating.
your field of research seems to align with what he's suggesting is the cause of the Younger Dryas period. That fragments of comets hitting the northern ice shelf and throwing ice up everywhere. Yeah, it's a very, very interesting topic.
Yeah, and they show these like in the Carolina bays, all these like holes, these kind of oblong holes in the Carolinas, and they think that maybe those were bits of ice that
Ice.
were thrown and then impacted.
Yeah.
And the reason we don't find the rock or any
Because
evidence, because it wasn't a
it
rock,
melted.
it just hits and melts on
Yeah.
impact because there's so much energy. And so you have all these oblong things, and then but they point kind of back to, somewhere in the northern latitudes where maybe there was a lot of ice. And, so there's a lot of fascinating angles that he's taking with this to help support this idea. So, I find it awesome. I love to listen to it. I'm still probably on the fence whether I'm convinced that that's the trigger. I think it is a good idea that it's probably a meltwater pulse. That's one of the big things that's doing this. And so, how do you trigger that? Well, impact is a great way of doing it.
Yeah.
But, I'm still a little bit on the fence. I'd love to get like smoking gun evidence.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Um, is it a telescope behind you?
Yes, that is.
Is that another interest?
Just because I do impact stuff and I kind of think about early Earth, I like to mess around and look out. It's that one's not the greatest, but you can see the rings of Jupiter. I mean, the rings of Saturn, very nicely through it. So
Seeing the
it's just
moon,
for fun.
seeing the moon is
Oh, the
amazing
moon,
in terms
yes,
of craters.
absolutely.
You know,
Oh my gosh, absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. The one thing with this one is that the motor on it is messing up, and so because the moon is so close, it moves through your line of
yeah,
sight really quickly. So you're constantly trying to find it again and moving it around. So when things like Saturn, it's so little out there, it takes a time to kind of cross through the field of view. So I can kind of find it and then I can show my kids and
yeah,
some other people and stuff like that. But the moon's like moving too fast out of there. So I got to get the gears fixed. But I do enjoy, just kind of the night sky and looking up and finding. I love to see satellites going by and,
mm,
just thinking about the how vast space is. It really makes you feel insignificant and really makes you think like, man, my problems are huge and, all of this and that. And I kind of look out there and I'm like,
no,
no, none of this really matters.
yeah. We're lucky where we are. We get a really nice view of the Milky Way on a clear, cold night. Yeah, it's mind blowing looking at those
It
stars
is.
and thinking they're just the ones in our galaxy. You know,
Yes, we're barely seeing out. I
Y-
mean, this is just our neighborhood. We're like looking down the street,
yeah,
and there's a whole city and a whole country beyond that we don't barely even see.
yeah.
I find it, I love it. I love looking at, I show my students all the time the James Webb photos that are coming online now, and it blows their mind seeing those new James Webb telescope photos.
It's amazing how far back in time they're able to see now.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, and the just the detail of these images, Hubble blew my mind
Yeah,
when it went up. I think that was mid 90s. I graduated high school in 96. I remember that had a big influence on like I want to be a scientist. Like this stuff
yeah.
is cool. And now seeing these James Webb these pictures, I'm just like, whew, I wish the thing didn't cost 6 times what it was originally budgeted for, but
Well,
that's the way it goes.
at least it's up there. And when you look at things like SpaceX now, and what's the other one? Not Hyperloop, uh, Hyperlaunch, which is this is quite amazing. These guys, I think it's like a 1 to 3, maybe it's 1 to 10. I think it's a 1 to 3 scale, a version of it, and it's a large rotating arm which attaches to the end of it a small thing that looks like a missile, and it spins it at super high speed and then releases it through a hole and shoots it into space. So it gets rid of all that energy requirement to get lift your fuel to get you up to launch velocity. You've actually got the thing traveling at like 10,000 kilometers per hour anyhow, and then you fire it off.
It's a
It's
space trebuchet.
yes, effectively, yeah, it is.
Wow.
I just
I
can't.
know. I haven't seen that.
I can't think of the name of it.
Have they've reached orbit? They can
And
get to
they've
they
they've
can get
they've
to escape velocity?
no, I don't know. Because this one that they've got that they're using is for testing purposes, but they're going to
Okay.
build. I think it's a 1 to 3 scale. They're going to build another one, and that they believe will do it. But I mean, it's interesting. It's not reusable. These small satellites that'll go in there will be sent out, but I think the overall cost will be minimal compared to a normal $3 or $4 billion launch to get a satellite up there. You're just not
Yeah,
paying for
which
any
is
fuel.
90% fuel.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
If maybe more, 98% fuel or something. It's something remarkable.
yeah.
For every kilogram of fuel you have, You need like an extra more of it to get that one up. And
Y-
so you have this kind of system of feedbacks. And then the actual payload is like nothing.
Yeah.
It's all fuel and rocket. And then like a tiny little payload up there just to, because, I mean, Earth's gravity is, you got to get to 11.2, I think, kilometers per second to get to escape velocity. And that just takes a lot of energy to leave
It's,
Earth's gravity.
it's
But
amazing.
what a fascinating way of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. A trebuchet. That's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
A space catapult.
Yeah. SpaceX showed some footage of one of the Falcons going up the other day, and it was like a GoPro looking back down at the Earth. That was really good to give you an impression of just how fast they move. It was astounding to see how quickly major structures just turned into tiny little ant-like buildings in a matter of
Yep.
seconds. Yeah.
Yeah. And you have to, otherwise Earth pulls you
See
right
back
back
down.
down.
Yeah.
And yeah, so when we talk a lot of in the class about like Mars missions and things, and a lot of my students are like, well, why don't they just put like a bigger rover and everything like that? I'm like, it's all about weight.
Yeah.
All they think about is weight,
Yeah.
how much power, how many instruments can they make small enough to get on there so that they can weigh less. It's all weight, and they were kind of shocked. And then when we talk about fuel and getting off the planet, they're like, oh yeah, that kind of starts to make sense.
Is
You know,
Is Mars? I mean, Mars is a great, interesting idea to get there. But does Mars suffer from the problem that the Earth would have in earlier times? That lack of atmosphere, it's a target for asteroids, meteors, impacts. Do you think is that a risk up there to try and terraform and civilize Mars?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're going to have to build an atmosphere
Yeah,
because, that's, you're right. Because, if you look at even the moon, things,
it's just pockmarked, isn't it?
yeah. And so what happens is our atmosphere protects us from all the little things. There's still a lot of little stuff whizzing around
Yeah,
in orbit. The big stuff's kind of been sucked up by the planet as it was forming, but there's a lot of little stuff. And because we have a nice, big, thick atmosphere, it's not really thick, but it's thick enough. Those things burn up upon entry, right? But then the moon, they slam into it. On Mars, there's a small, 1/10 of the atmosphere, and so their little things keep whizzing in. But there's also no magnetic field, so you
yeah.
are exposed to a lot of radiation. That's going to be a real big issue. I mean, we're going to have some sort of radiation protection. And the biggest thing, though, we have to raise the pressure because right now on Mars, the pressure is below the triple point of water. So liquid water can't exist on the surface of Mars. It goes from solid to gas
Ah,
because of the pressure. So if we could increase the pressure, right, that would probably require some way of introducing an atmosphere so that we can have a pressure. Then we could start to get liquid water. But at the moment, Mars cannot have liquid water on its surface because it's below the triple point. So it only goes from the solid to the gas phase. It sublimates, and without liquid water, I don't really see us being there for long.
so you've got to do something like pump out a whole heap of heavy gas over the
Yeah,
surface of the planet, and then try and put some water underneath that, and maybe get enough pressure to keep it as liquid water. Yeah,
yeah.
interesting
This is,
challenge.
we're talking.
That's a big
I
job.
don't know. Yeah, to me, it's, I don't even think it will happen in my kid's lifetime.
Yeah,
But technology advances so quickly. But this we're talking serious challenges here.
yeah,
Planetary
yeah,
scale challenges,
yeah,
and so that's a big thing to do. That's going to be a lot of money. It's going to be a lot of engineering, but it's cool to think about.
yeah,
I think the moon was where we should start.
yeah. And do what on the moon? Try to build an atmosphere and survive there, or mine
Well,
it,
no,
or
but yeah, at least have a colony so we understand long-term effects and humans that could spend longer term up there. I think it's a great place to put telescopes,
yeah,
especially on the far side, right? Um, but we could think about mining, but it's so close. It's just such a easier target that we can at least develop these technologies and figure this stuff out. We haven't sent a human to another planet
yeah,
or a body in the solar system since the 60s, 70s, 60s,
yeah.
whatever. Yeah, 71.
70s.
I
Yeah,
forget. Yeah, and so all of a sudden now we're just going to fly off to Mars and do it. I think we got to start with with the moon, but I think it's happening. The Chinese are going to do it. We're going to do it. You can see this kind of space race kicking off again, which I think
yeah,
is very healthy. This kind of competition, everybody wanting to one up each other. Back in the 60s, they were firing off a rocket like every 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Like every month there was like an Apollo. It's crazy how like this thing was a juggernaut. And now, it's it
I,
somehow space has lost interest to people and in the public.
I think there's some incentives now to get there, because I've seen a lot of articles of late. Oh, we can mine this. We'll get deuterium from the moon. There's plenty of it up there. These type of things which might become more desirable if we do start to move into different types of fusion reactors, or even different types of fission reactors. Comets. I hear about comets. We want to mine a comet because it's full of something that's rare down here. So yeah, I guess there's some incentives to get there.
Yeah, and these asteroid mining projects, there's a couple big startups that are going, and there's a lot of rare earth elements on these things. There's platinum group elements. These are things that we think the Earth did a really good job of segregating out down into the core, because these are metallic things. And so when the Earth is going through a process we call differentiation, where all the irons and all the heavy metals are sinking to the core, that left us with very little on the crust. But these little asteroids never went through that process, so they're full of this stuff all over the place. And it's still a big challenge, right? Do you grab it and bring it close by? I would love to grab it and bring it closer to the moon somehow, instead of trying to do this all in space.
Yeah.
Maybe break these things up and then bring them to the moon. But I'm fascinated with it. It seems like there's money going into it.
That's just so science fiction. That's such a cool thought.
It is, right?
Capture an asteroid, we'll drag it down to the moon, we'll chop it up, and we'll send the good stuff back to Earth.
It's crazy to think about, but wow, it just shows human ingenuity, and coming back to like climate and people. I always tell them, like, look at all the stuff we did. I know that means we have a big impact because we have a lot of raw materials and things like that. But it also means that we can solve a ton of problems because we have technology. We're ingenuitive, and so like I have such a positive outlook. As opposed to so many of my students that have such a negative and pessimistic outlook.
Well, that's the thing. If that's the way they're being told to think, the whole postmodernist ideology where we reject science and logic makes it tough for these guys to be able to say, you know what, the data says we should be okay. Let's go and have kids, because we need people to have kids. We need the next generation of healthy, smart people to figure out the next set of problems.
That's right. That's right. And so brings us back a little bit to climate. So I argue part of why I'm upset at the earth science community and people like the IPCC and the WEF and the UN is that they're pushing this narrative, and their claim is, well, we know that it's probably a little overblown, and sometimes we don't show the other side, but the ends justify the means. This is such a threat that it's okay if we kind of play a little fast and loose with the data, because ultimately we need people, to change their behavior. And I argue that what that does is it degrades the trust in science.
Yeah.
And when we get into our next bigger challenge, because there's going to be another bigger challenge down the road, there always is, they're not, people aren't going to trust people like me, scientists. They're not going to trust the science, because they're going to remember, but remember in climate, you guys were telling us this. COVID is a great example, right? We're just losing trust because people are willing to not kind of show both sides. And I always tell my students, I'm like, I'm not going to convince you one way or the other. That's not my goal. But I'm going to present all the data to you on all sides. I'm going to let you make up your own mind. I want you to always stay open and let your mind change if new observations and new data comes to light. And I'm going to give you my opinion why I don't think there's compelling evidence that we're in a climate crisis.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I'm not here to teach you what to think. I'm here to teach you how to think, how to critically think about this stuff. And I'll tell you how I do it. But, I leave it to you to decide. And
that approach is the way to do it, to give people evidence from both sides. I actively on Twitter seek out people that I know are ideologically opposed to me, and I look at some of their tweets and they infuriate me, but I get them into my feed so that I've got that other view and that other angle, and whether it's to sometimes make me change my mind or sometimes to help me solidify my position. This is a problem that's happening with social media, where one voice is being suppressed, because it's very easy to believe a story if all you're hearing is that story. When you get other information, now you can do that critical thinking. You can say, okay, here's this, here's that. Okay, maybe this doesn't seem as believable anymore. But if you're lacking that input of additional viewpoints, you're stuck. That's not good for science.
Yeah, and that's where a lot of the consensus comes out of. You kicked all the people out that don't agree with you, And so, yeah, of
Yep.
course you have a 95%
Yeah.
agree rate because you kicked them all out.
Yeah.
You know? So if you come to the conference in Orlando that I'm going to be at, I mean, you poll those people, you're probably going to get something like 10%,
Yeah.
right? Because you don't have the other side there. And so, it's very convenient for the consensus argument just to kick everybody out
Yeah.
and say there's a consensus.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey,
It's
Matthew,
unfortunate.
it is. Hey, thank you so much for today, for having a chat. It's been great.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I enjoy it. I mean, I love discussing this stuff, and hopefully more discussions like this get people thinking about it and not calling each other names and having personal attacks, because
Yeah.
there's a lot of feelings about this stuff, especially climate. Like, people have intense feelings,
Yeah.
but feelings cloud our judgment a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So we can objectively discuss, and I have two young kids. I'm not sitting back somewhere planning on how I'm going to burn up the planet, right? And ruin the planet for their lives. And so, we have to have open civil discussion in order for us to solve our future problems. And we can't label each other names because I'm a pluralist. We can agree to disagree, and that's fine.
Yeah.
Right? Doesn't For some reason the nature now is like, if you don't agree with me, you're my enemy.
Yeah. Which is a terrible idea. Terrible approach.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But I really enjoyed it, Tim. I appreciate it.
Hey, look, I hope things go well for you online, man. I hope things go well. And keep in touch. I'd love to have you back on again at some stage in the future.
Absolutely. I'd love to come on.
All right. Awesome. Thank you.
All right.
There we go. Stop the recording. Hey, yeah, just again without